It's a smell you never forget. A scent so powerful it haunts you, stays with you long after you've left the place, and I'm telling you now, it was in the air. Right here, in this terminal. It wasn't supposed to be this way. Officer. Miller had been here countless times working alongside K9 Bandit, sniffing out narcotics, explosives, and anything dangerous they could catch on the wind. It was a routine, a job. That's all it ever was until tonight. But something was different. Something changed. Bandit was a good dog. A great dog, actually. His work ethic was unmatched, his nose razor sharp. But tonight he wasn't sniffing for the usual. Drugs, weapons, contraband. Tonight, Bandit's attention was focused elsewhere. And that's when it hit him. The scent. Not just any scent. A smell so familiar, so specific that it stopped him dead in his tracks. It was faint at first, buried under the usual diesel exhaust and the stale scent of overpriced pretzels. But there, beneath it all, was something else. Something that sent a cold chill down Miller's spine. Strawberry shampoo. That sweet, innocent scent of childhood. And fear. The odor wrapped around Miller like a thick fog, instantly flooding his mind with a memory. Her. The little girl he'd been searching for 3 long months. Evie Hawthorne. But how? How could she be here? How could her scent, buried in a pink pajama shirt sealed in an evidence bag miles away, be right here in this very terminal? Bandit didn't wait for an explanation. He didn't wait for Miller's command. The dog's nose shot into the air, and in one fluid motion, he started pulling toward the crowd, ignoring Miller's voice as it grew louder, demanding answers. Bandit, sit. What are you doing? But the dog wasn't listening. He was on a mission. His instincts were telling him something Miller didn't want to believe. The ghost was here, and she was alive. Miller's heart raced. He glanced at Bandit's intense, unblinking gaze. That was no typical search behavior. This wasn't a sniff for drugs or weapons. It was something else entirely. This wasn't just a routine. This was personal. Miller swallowed hard, trying to push the panic back down his throat. He trusted Bandit, trusted that the K9's instincts were sharper than his own. But this wasn't how it was supposed to go. With one last fleeting glance at the baggage claim area, Miller followed, Bandit through the crowd, his pulse pounding in his ears. Whatever was happening, he wasn't ready for it. But there was no turning back now. If you're hooked, don't forget to hit subscribe and stay tuned for the next part of this intense K9 investigation. You won't want to miss what happens next. The terminal was buzzing with activity. Travelers hurried to their gates, dragging their luggage behind them, parents tugging on their kids' hands as the late-night rush unfolded. Miller tried to shake the unease from his shoulders, but it was like trying to get rid of a shadow. The scent, that damn scent, still clung to the air. Bandit had stopped moving, but his nose was still up, testing the air, taking in every detail. Miller had never seen his partner act like this before. It wasn't normal. K9 dogs trained to alert on narcotics, explosives, and even fugitives didn't act like this. They were professionals, focused. But Bandit was different tonight. Bandit. What the hell is it, boy? Miller muttered, though he already knew. The dog wasn't listening. Bandit didn't just ignore the command. He was pulling, dragging Miller toward the waiting area, his paws slipping slightly on the polished floor as he strained against the leash. Miller felt a pit form in his stomach. He tried to hold on, tried to get control. Bandit! His voice came out sharper, but it barely made a dent. He'd seen this before, but not like this. Bandit was like a machine, every muscle tight, his tail stiff, his whole body vibrating with tension. It was as if the dog had picked up on something bigger than a typical scent. The crowd around them didn't notice. Or maybe they just didn't care. Miller saw a couple of people glance at them, giving the uniformed officer a bored, half-hearted nod. Nothing to see here. Just another K9 unit doing their thing. But Miller knew something wasn't right. He could feel it in his gut. As Bandit dragged him further through the terminal, Miller's mind raced. He could barely focus on anything else. The The strange scent in the air, the dog's behavior, it all pointed to one thing. Evie. His mind flashed back to the day she disappeared. That horrible day 3 months ago. The day a 5-year-old girl vanished from her own front yard, like she'd simply disappeared into thin air. The case had turned cold. No leads, no suspects, nothing but a family left to wonder until now. Until Bandit had stopped dead in his tracks and led him right to it. Bandit stopped in front of a row of chairs, his body low, his stance aggressive. Miller caught up to him, the leash taut in his hand. The dog's nose was still working, sniffing, the air as if it could pull her out of the crowd and into his paws. Miller's eyes darted around, scanning the area, trying to see what Bandit was focused on. And then, through the bustling crowd, he saw it. A man, standing near Gate 14 holding the hand of a little girl. She was tiny, no more than 5 years old, wearing a pair of oversized sunglasses and a blue baseball cap. It didn't register at first. The girl seemed normal. Too normal. Just a father and daughter waiting to board a flight, probably to some sunny destination. Nothing out of the ordinary, except for the way the man's eyes kept flicking nervously to the entrance, checking his watch every few seconds. There was something off about him. Miller's heart began to pound harder. He felt the air thickening around him. Bandit wasn't just acting this way for no reason. Something was off. The man turned his back to Miller, focusing entirely on the little girl. She wasn't crying, she wasn't struggling, she wasn't doing anything at all. She was just standing there, quiet and still, holding her doll. There was something unsettling about the calmness of it. Something about the girl didn't seem right. "Stay close, Bandit," Miller murmured, trying to gain some control. But Bandit was already shifting his weight, preparing to lunge forward. Miller's grip on the leash tightened. The dog let out a soft growl, just a low rumbling sound, but it was enough to send a chill down Miller's spine. Bandit wasn't growling at the man. No, Bandit's focus was on the girl. Miller's heart skipped. This was it. The man, oblivious to the tension building behind him, continued to watch the terminal, his hand still clutching the girl's small, and it seemed almost like a normal fatherly gesture, except the grip was tight, too tight, as if he were afraid she might slip away, as if he knew something Miller didn't. Miller took a deep breath and stepped forward. He was a professional, trained for this kind of thing, but this felt different. There was a sense of urgency he hadn't expected. The dog's body was locked in place, but Miller felt a pull in his chest. A quiet, desperate tug. This wasn't just a random stop. This was personal. Bandit knew it, and now Miller did too. "Sir," Miller called out, keeping his voice steady. "Excuse me, sir. I need to speak with you for a moment." The man's head snapped up, his eyes widening slightly. Miller could see the flash of panic behind his eyes, but it was quick, gone before it could settle. He forced a smile, trying to remain calm. "We're gonna miss our bus, officer," the man said, his voice rough, almost too calm. "I really don't have time for this." Miller didn't buy it. There was no real urgency in his tone, just a hint of fear, something Miller couldn't quite put his finger on. The way the man shifted his weight, the way his eyes darted, checking for something or someone. It all screamed of guilt. But what was he guilty of? Miller took another step forward, his hand resting on his radio, ready to call for backup if needed. This was no longer just a routine. This was a lead, and Miller wasn't going to let it slip through his fingers. "Sir," Miller repeated, his voice firmer. "I need you to step aside. I'm going to need some information from you." Miller's stomach twisted as he watched the man's every move, the way he shifted, the way his hand clenched the girl's, pulling her just a little closer as if to shield her. There was something so familiar about it, something Miller had seen too many times before in his line of work, but nothing ever looked so wrong. The man wasn't just a concerned father. There was a quiet desperation in his actions, a hint of fear that Miller couldn't ignore. "Sir," Miller called again, his voice cutting through the low hum of the terminal, but the man didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked at Miller like he was weighing the situation, trying to decide whether to make a run for it or play the part of the confused, innocent father. But Miller had seen this before, people acting innocent when they were anything but. The tight grip, the flicker of panic in the man's eyes, and now, the way he kept glancing around like he was looking for an escape route. This wasn't right. This wasn't just some nervous traveler. No, Miller was beginning to feel it. This man was hiding something. Bandit's nose twitched again and the dog let out a low growl, more intense this time. His body was locked in place, his eyes focused on the girl, whose wide, vacant stare seemed to pierce through everything around her. She wasn't afraid, but there was something hollow about her expression, like she wasn't even really here. Miller's heart pounded in his chest. Could this really be her? Could Bandit have finally tracked down the girl who had been missing for months? The girl's pink pajama shirt, the scent of strawberry shampoo that Bandit had locked onto. It all pointed to her. But how was she here? How was she standing in front of him, so calm, so still, while the man who held her hand acted like he was trying to hide her from the world? The puzzle pieces were starting to fall into place, but Miller didn't like what he was seeing. His gut told him there was more to this than just a missing child found by a K-9 unit. "Sir, I need you to step aside," Miller repeated, his voice firm now, each word feeling heavier than the last. His eyes scanned the crowd, looking for any signs of backup, any sign that someone else had noticed this strange interaction. But it was like the world was moving in slow motion. The hum of the terminal faded into the background, and all he could hear was the faint sound of Bandit's low growl. Everything else felt distant, as if Miller were in a dream. The man's eyes darted again. This time, his gaze lingered on Miller for a fraction longer. "We're just waiting for the bus," the man said, his voice a little too calm, a little too rehearsed. He pulled the girl a step closer, shielding her with his body as if to block Miller's view. Miller's instincts were screaming at him now. He wasn't going to let this slip. He was done waiting. He couldn't afford to wait for a sign anymore. If this was her, if this was the girl who had been missing for months, then Miller had to act. He couldn't let the man walk away with her. "Bandit," Miller whispered, barely audible, but Bandit heard it loud and clear. The dog's body stiffened, its gaze locked onto the girl. Miller held his breath for a moment, watching the K-9's every move. Bandit took a step forward, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he knew exactly what to do. He nudged his head past the man, pushing him aside just enough to get closer to the girl. The girl's eyes never left Bandit. She reached out a tiny hand, not in fear, but in recognition. Her small fingers brushed against Bandit's fur. It hit Miller like a freight train. She knew the dog. The realization settled in his gut, cold and uncomfortable. This was her. This was Evie Hawthorne, and she was alive. Miller's heart raced as he let go of the leash. Bandit, now completely focused, moved closer to the girl's small backpack. His nose was all over it, tracing every inch of the fabric. The smell of the strawberry shampoo unmistakable. Without hesitation, Bandit sat down, his posture relaxed but his gaze unflinching. That was the sign. The confirmation Miller had been waiting for. The passive alert. The moment Bandit sat down, Miller knew. It was like a weight lifted off his shoulders, but the relief was quickly replaced with a deeper sense of urgency. He couldn't just stand there. He had to act. Miller snapped back to the man, who now looked even more desperate. His grip on the girl's hand was tight, too tight. "What's your name?" Miller asked, his voice steady but demanding. He was done playing games. The man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he hesitated. Then he finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "She's not yours. She's not anyone's." Miller's jaw clenched. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. The man wasn't even trying to deny it anymore. He wasn't even pretending to be innocent. "I'm not letting her go," Miller said, the words firm, unyielding. He could feel the adrenaline rushing through him now. Every instinct was on high alert. The dog had found her, but now Miller had to make sure this man didn't take her away again. The girl, still holding her doll, looked up at Miller. She didn't say anything, didn't cry or scream. She just stared at him, her face unreadable. Miller could see the fear in her eyes, but it wasn't the fear of someone who had been lost for months. No, this was the kind of fear someone had when they had been trapped in a situation far worse than Miller had imagined. As Miller took a step closer, he felt the tension in the air thicken. This wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. The man had made his choice, and now it was Miller's turn to make his. The sound of Miller's heartbeat was the only thing he could hear now, thumping in his ears like a drum. He stared at the girl, her small hand still extended toward Bandit, fingers brushing lightly against his fur. Bandit stood there, motionless, his eyes locked on hers. In that moment, there was no need for words. It was clear. This was her. Yo, missing girl. But as Miller's gaze shifted to the man standing there, still stiff and defensive, the reality of the situation hit him like a freight train. The man had failed to run. He hadn't fought back when Miller had stepped forward, but there was a sense of desperation in his eyes, like he knew exactly what was coming. Miller's hand hovered over his radio, but he didn't speak into it yet. He didn't want to spook the man. The last thing he needed was for the situation to escalate, but he wasn't about to let the girl slip away again. The terminal's bright fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a cold, harsh glow over everything. People milled around them, oblivious to the silent standoff unfolding just a few feet away. They walked past without a second glance, too wrapped up in their own lives to notice the gravity of the moment, but Miller couldn't look away. He couldn't take his eyes off the girl, who still hadn't said a word. Her oversized sunglasses hung low on her face, obscuring her eyes, but there was something in the way she held herself that tugged at his heart. She wasn't just a missing child anymore. She was a survivor. She had been through something no child should ever have to endure. And now she was standing here in front of him, as if she was caught between two worlds, the one she had known and the one she was being dragged into. Where did you find her? Miller's voice was low, deliberate, aimed directly at the man. He wanted an answer, but more than that, he needed to know how deep this went. Was this just a kidnapping gone wrong? Or was something more sinister at play here? The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, his eyes darted around the terminal again, like he was calculating his next move. Miller didn't budge. He couldn't afford to. The situation was fragile, and any wrong move could tip it over the edge. The man's fingers twitched, but he didn't pull the girl closer or try to shield her from Miller. Instead, he stepped back slightly, lowering his head. The weight of his silence was almost louder than any words he could have said. "Who are you?" Miller asked, his voice firmer this time, but not without a trace of empathy. He had to remember that in his line of work, sometimes the people he dealt with were victims too. This man could be another victim of something darker. Miller couldn't ignore that. He wasn't in the business of assuming guilt. He was in the business of finding the truth. But the man didn't respond. He just stood there, eyes never leaving Bandit. The dog's gaze was unwavering. He wasn't acting like a normal canine. This wasn't just a trained alert anymore. This was something else. Bandit was telling Miller everything he needed to know, even if the man wasn't willing to speak. Miller could feel the air thickening between them. His hand hovered over his radio again, but this time he wasn't waiting. He couldn't afford to wait. He needed backup, and he needed it now. He tapped the button on his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Miller, K9 Unit. I need backup at Port Authority, Gate 14. Possible abduction in progress. Suspect is in custody. I have positive identification on the missing child, Evie Hawthorne. Repeat, positive identification." Miller's eyes never left the man. There was no turning back now. The game had changed. It was no longer a simple case of a missing child. It was something bigger, something darker. But what? The girl still hadn't spoken, hadn't moved. She just stood there, still and silent, her small hand still outstretched toward Bandit. It was as if the dog had become a lifeline, the one thing in this chaotic world that made her feel safe. The moment felt frozen in time, and for a brief second, Miller thought about what she must have gone through, He wondered if she recognized him or if she was still too scared to trust anyone. Had she been told lies? Had the man who claimed to be her father brainwashed her into thinking he was the one to protect her? Or had she been too afraid to trust anyone else? Evie? Miller said softly, his voice gentle as he took a step closer. My name is Officer Miller. You're safe now, you're not alone. The girl didn't respond at first, and Miller couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy. She was so small, so fragile. Her eyes, hidden behind the sunglasses, gave away nothing. She didn't flinch when he spoke, but she didn't acknowledge him either. She was still caught in the silence, as though waiting for something, or someone, to pull her out of the fog that had clouded her life. The man, standing a few feet away, was breathing heavily now. Miller could hear the sharp, shallow intakes of air. The man's hand tightened on the girl's wrist, but it wasn't enough to pull her away from Bandit. It was as if he had given up. Miller took another slow step forward, careful not to provoke the man, but with a sense of urgency now. You need to come with me, he said, more to the man than the girl. You're not going anywhere until I get some answers. The man's gaze flickered from Miller to Bandit, then back to the girl. His shoulders slumped slightly, and for the first time Miller saw him hesitate. His mouth opened like he was about to say something, but no words came out. The silence hung between them thick and heavy. And then finally the girl took a step forward. Her small hand reached out again, not toward Bandit, but toward Miller. It was slow, uncertain, but it was enough to break the tension. Miller didn't hesitate. He knelt down in front of her, slowly, carefully, meeting her gaze with his own. The weight of her past hung in the air, but in that moment, she was no longer a missing child. She was Evie Hawthorne, and she was going to be okay. Miller's gut twisted as he watched the man, still silent, still standing there like a cornered animal, his eyes flickering between Bandit, the girl, and the looming figure of Officer Miller. The tension in the air felt so thick, it was almost suffocating. The terminal, which had once been full of the usual bustle, now felt like a cage, the walls closing in on them. The man's hand tightened around the girl's wrist again, but she didn't flinch. She didn't even look up at him. It was like she had already chosen, and Miller wasn't sure whether that was a sign of relief or something more disturbing. Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time, Miller said, his voice firm. But there was an edge to it now. He couldn't afford to dance around this any longer. He needed answers. The girl was alive, yes. But how? And why was she with this man? The man didn't respond. His gaze locked on Miller, and for the first time, Miller saw something there. Something that didn't fit. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger either. It was a strange kind of resignation. Like he knew his time was up, but he wasn't ready to let go yet. You don't get to walk away from this, Miller continued, taking a step closer. His heart was hammering in his chest, but he wasn't backing down now. She's been missing for 3 months, and you're not leaving here until I understand how you're involved in this. There it was. The crack. The slightest change in the man's posture. His shoulders sagged just a bit more, like the weight of everything had finally hit him. But still, he didn't speak. He didn't even try to explain. Miller could feel the man's resistance growing like a wall going up between them, but something wasn't adding up. This wasn't how it usually went. In cases like this, people lied. They made up stories. They tried to wriggle out of the truth. But this man? He wasn't even trying to spin a tale. It was like he was waiting for something. Or maybe he had already decided it was over, and that's when it hit him. The man wasn't afraid of being caught. He was afraid of something else. Miller's eyes flickered to the girl, whose expression had remained unreadable this entire time. She hadn't said a word since he first spoke to her, but now something about her seemed different. She had started to sway ever so slightly, like she was about to fall. Without thinking, Miller took a step forward, his focus shifting to her. Hey, you all right? He asked, his voice gentle. But there was an urgency there now. Something in his chest clenched. The girl didn't respond. She didn't even look at him, but she took a small step forward, almost as if she were walking through a fog. It was as though she was lost in a trance, but at the same time she knew exactly where she was going. Miller glanced back at the man. "What have you done to her?" His voice was tight now, fear starting to creep into his chest. The man's eyes hardened, and for the first time, he took a step back, pulling the girl a little closer to him. "She's not yours," he said, his voice low. But there was an edge to it now. She never was. Miller's heart skipped. The words hit him like a punch, but they didn't make sense. What was the man saying? "What does that mean?" Miller asked, his voice rising. "What do you mean she's not mine?" The man didn't respond. Instead, he looked down at the girl, who had now come to a complete stop, her small face still, hidden behind the sunglasses. She was breathing deeply, her chest rising and falling slowly, but she didn't speak. She didn't acknowledge Miller at all. The air felt suffocating. Miller was caught between the man and the girl, but it wasn't just the situation that felt wrong. It was the silence, the weight of it. The man had no excuses, no lies to tell. He wasn't fighting back. It was like he had resigned himself to whatever was coming. Miller's mind raced. Was this man her father? Her abductor? Her captor? What the hell was going on here? That's when the man did something unexpected. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a brief second, and then let out a shaky sigh. "She wasn't supposed to be part of this," he muttered, barely audible, but Miller heard it. His words were like a key turning in a lock. The air shifted again, like everything had just changed. The man wasn't speaking in the language of someone who had just kidnapped a child. He was speaking like someone who was trapped in a nightmare, forced to play a role that had already gone too far. Miller could see it now. The man was no longer just the kidnapper. He was a man with a story, a man caught in the web of something much bigger than himself. Miller could feel the weight of those words hanging between them. "What do you mean? She wasn't supposed to be part of this." Miller pressed, his voice demanding an answer. His heart pounded louder in his chest. This was it. This was the moment that could unravel everything. The man met his gaze, his eyes filled with something Miller couldn't quite name. Fear? Regret? Desperation? "She wasn't supposed to be the one," the man said, his voice shaky but steady. "But things got complicated. And now it's too late." Miller's breath caught in his throat. His mind was reeling, but he couldn't stop the questions from piling up. What had this man done? What was he involved in? And what role did the girl play in all of it? Before Miller could ask another question, the man turned away, pulling the girl with him. "It's too late," he repeated, more to himself than to anyone else. And just like that, the story was no longer about a missing child. It was about something much darker, something Miller wasn't prepared for. The man didn't look back as he moved through the terminal. His grip on the girl's wrist tightened as if he was trying to pull her into his own shadow. Miller stood, frozen for a moment, his mind racing, trying to make sense of everything that had just been said. "It's too late" wasn't just a statement, it was a warning, a confession. And that's when it hit Miller harder than any physical blow. The man wasn't just hiding something, he was running from something. He wasn't scared of the law. He was scared of something much bigger than any officer in this terminal. "Hey," Miller shouted, taking a step forward, his voice laced with authority. "Stop right there." The man paused for a moment, his back still to Miller. His shoulders stiffened, but he didn't turn around. It was like he was weighing his options, whether to run or to face whatever fate Miller was about to force upon him. Miller's hand hovered over his radio, but he didn't call for backup just yet. Not yet. He was close. So close to unraveling whatever twisted mess had brought this man and this little girl to this point. But first he needed answers. Miller was used to dangerous situations. He'd been in countless standoffs, had dealt with aggressive suspects, and even chased down fleeing criminals in the dead of night. But something about this felt different. There was no shouting, no resistance. The man was like a ghost, fading into the shadows, leaving nothing but questions behind. "Turn around," Miller demanded, his voice firmer now, as the space between them began to shrink. But the man stayed silent, just barely glancing over his shoulder. The girl was still by his side, her head down, her face hidden behind the sunglasses she hadn't removed since Miller first saw her. For a second, Miller thought he saw her take a breath, a slow, shaky one. It was the first sign of life from her in what felt like an eternity. Miller's heart pounded in his chest. He was done asking questions. This was his case now, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. "Where's the girl's mother?" Miller asked, keeping his voice steady, but the urgency was clear. He wasn't sure why the question escaped his lips, but as soon as he said it, he knew it was the right one. The man's entire body tensed. The muscles in his back stiffened as if he had been struck by a bolt of lightning. For the first time, he turned fully around, his eyes narrowing as they met Miller's. The intensity of the stare sent a chill up Miller's spine. The man's jaw clenched, his lips curling into a faint, bitter smile. "You think you can just walk in here and fix this?" he sneered, his voice harsh. "You think you can just play hero?" Miller didn't flinch. He couldn't. Not now. This wasn't about saving face. It was about saving a life. Evie's life. "We're past the games, pal," Miller replied, his voice flat, even though his adrenaline was surging. "Where's her mother?" The man took a step forward, closing the distance between them. Miller didn't budge, not an inch. "The girl's mother is gone. She doesn't matter anymore," he said, his words cold like they had been carved out of ice. "It's always been about her, though, about what she can be." Miller's mind raced. The more the man spoke, the more it seemed like he was trying to convince himself, not just Miller. "Who are you?" Miller asked, the question hanging heavy in the air. The man hesitated for a split second, his eyes flickering. Then, almost as if he couldn't hold it back anymore, he said, "I'm the one who was supposed to protect her, from the very beginning. But everything changed, I never had a choice." The words didn't make sense, not yet, but something about the way he spoke. It felt genuine, like the man was at the end of his rope. Miller's gut told him there was more to this story. A lot more. Before Miller could respond, the man's hand shot out, grabbing the girl's wrist. Again. He pulled her away from Miller, dragging her back toward the crowded gates, his steps quickening. The girl didn't resist. She was still silent, still detached, her small hand limp in his grasp. Miller's heart stopped. He had to act now. "Stop!" Miller shouted, reaching for his radio, but this time he didn't need to say another word. Bandit was already moving, charging forward with one goal in mind. The K-9, still locked onto the girl, didn't hesitate for a second. With a sudden, swift movement, Bandit lunged, his paws hitting the floor hard as he shot past Miller, faster than the human eye could follow. The man froze as Bandit came barreling toward them, and for the first time, there was fear in his eyes. Miller couldn't stop himself. He ran after the dog, his boots pounding against the polished terminal floor, the sound echoing in the chaos of the crowd. Bandit, in perfect sync with Miller, pushed the man back, his powerful frame knocking the man off balance. The girl stumbled, but she didn't fall. She didn't move either. She was frozen in place, her wide eyes still staring straight ahead. "Get back," the man shouted, his voice full of panic now. "She's not yours." But Miller was done listening. Bandit's growl echoed through the terminal, a deep primal sound that made the hairs on the back of Miller's neck stand on end. He was on the verge of making his move when the crowd started to react. People around them began to scream, some ducking out of the way, others running for cover. But Miller had no time for that. The only thing that mattered now was getting the girl to safety. "Evie," Miller called, his voice breaking through the noise. "It's okay. You're going to be all right." For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The man's grip loosened, and the girl's sunglasses slipped off her face, revealing her wide, scared eyes. She looked at Miller, her expression unreadable. Then, without warning, she took a step forward, her small hand reaching out. Miller didn't hesitate. He knelt down, pulling her into his arms, his heart pounding with the rush of adrenaline. Bandit stood beside him, watching over them, ever the protector. The man didn't try to fight anymore. He didn't even speak. He just stood there, watching, as Miller held the girl. For a second, Miller allowed himself to close his eyes, taking a deep breath. She was safe, but the story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The moment Miller wrapped his arms around Evie, something shifted inside him. It wasn't just relief. It was an overwhelming sense of responsibility, a fierce determination to protect this girl at all costs. She wasn't just another case. She wasn't just a missing person. This little girl was a survivor, and Miller was her lifeline now. But the man wasn't backing down. He stood frozen in the crowd, his face twisted with a mix of fear and something darker. Miller couldn't tell if it was anger, frustration, or just pure helplessness, but he wasn't about to give the man the chance to figure it out. Bandit stayed right by Miller's side, his posture alert, tail rigid, as though he was daring anyone to make the wrong move. The K9's growl rumbled low in his throat, an instinctual warning that could freeze anyone in their tracks. Even the crowd, now more aware of what was happening, seemed to hold their breath. No one wanted to make a scene, but everyone knew that something big was unfolding in front of them. "Step back," Miller ordered, his voice cutting through the tension. His hand instinctively moved toward his holster, a subtle gesture that sent a clear message. He wasn't here for a confrontation, he wasn't here for a fight. But if it came down to it, he was prepared to take whatever steps were necessary to keep Evie safe. The man's eyes darted toward Miller, then down to the girl, who had buried her face into Miller's chest. For a second, he almost looked like he was going to reach out, like he might try to pull her away again. But then he froze. It was like something clicked for him. Maybe it was the fact that Miller had Evie in his arms, or maybe it was the presence of Bandit, so resolute in his protective stance. Either way, the man's shoulders slumped. The fight left him, but it wasn't a victory for Miller, not yet. The man spoke, his voice low and strained. "You have no idea what you're doing," he said, his words carrying a weight of defeat. "You're making a bigger mistake than you realize." Miller's brow furrowed. "You're the one who's making mistakes," he said, stepping closer to the man, his voice firm. "You're the one who took her." Evie didn't move. She just stayed close, her tiny hands gripping Miller's jacket like a lifeline. She still hadn't said a word, but Miller could feel her breathing, shallow and uneven against him. He wasn't sure what kind of trauma she had endured in the past few months, but he knew it was deep. The man's eyes flicked nervously toward the door as if considering his options. It was clear to Miller that the man was no longer trying to escape, not physically, but emotionally, mentally. It was like he was at war with himself, and Miller didn't know if that was going to make things better or worse. "What's going on here?" Miller asked, his tone softening slightly but still sharp. He needed answers. This wasn't just about getting Evie back. It was about understanding why she'd been taken in the first place. "Why did you take her? What's your involvement in all of this?" The man didn't answer right away. He looked at Miller, then to the girl, and something flickered in his eyes. Was it guilt? Regret? Miller couldn't tell, but it was enough to make him wonder if the man had been coerced into this or if he was just a cog in a larger machine. "It was supposed to be temporary," the man muttered, his words coming out like a confession. "They promised they would take care of her, that it would all be temporary." Miller felt a shiver crawl up his spine. "Who promised?" he pressed, his voice calm but insistent. The man didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, shifting from one foot to the other, clearly trying to decide whether to run or keep talking. It was like he couldn't decide what would make the situation worse. Miller's eyes narrowed. "Look, I don't know what's going on here, but I'm not letting you take her again. Not after everything she's been through." The man's face twisted with anger. "You think you can fix this? You think you can just waltz in and save her? You don't know what you're dealing with." Miller stayed silent for a moment, his gaze unwavering. "You're right," he said, voice steady. I don't know exactly what's going on. But I do know this. She's not your prisoner. She's not some piece of property for you to move around. And she deserves to be safe, damn it. For the first time, the man looked almost broken. His shoulders slumped further and his hands trembled as he ran one through his disheveled hair. I didn't have a choice, he said, his voice cracking. I was just doing what I was told. They said they'd leave her with me, keep her safe. But they lied. All of them. He paused, glancing at Miller with a bitter, almost haunted look. I couldn't protect her from them. Miller's mind reeled. The man wasn't just a kidnapper. He wasn't some random stranger who'd stolen a child for selfish reasons. This man had been forced into something much darker, something Miller didn't fully understand yet. What do you mean, they? Miller asked, his heart pounding. Who are you talking about? But before the man could answer, a voice cut through the tension. Officer Miller. Miller turned sharply, his heart leaping in his chest. 2 more officers had arrived, backup. It was about damn time. The sudden presence of additional officers brought a sense of relief, but also urgency. Miller needed answers, and he needed them fast. Take him in, Miller ordered, his voice decisive. The officers moved quickly, and the man didn't resist. He didn't even try. As the man was led away, Miller glanced down at Evie, who still hadn't spoken. Her face was buried in his chest, her small body trembling. Evie, Miller whispered, crouching down in front of her. You're safe now. We're going to get you home. The girl didn't respond, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Miller thought he saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Not fear, not the hollow emptiness from before, but maybe, just maybe, there was a tiny spark of hope. And that was all Miller needed. Miller's mind was spinning. He had the girl in his arms, the man in custody, and the terminal slowly returning to its usual chaos. The bright fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly, but the world around him felt still, like everything had come to a stop. The fact that he had Evie in his arms, safe, was the only thing that seemed real anymore. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized the questions were piling up faster than answers. Who was the man? And who exactly was they? Miller couldn't shake the feeling that there was something bigger at play here. This wasn't just a case of a missing child. It was a piece of something much larger, something that was far from over. Evie remained silent, her tiny body trembling against his chest. The moment she was placed into Miller's arms, it felt like a weight had shifted. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a symbol of something darker, a sign of how far some people would go to control others. Miller held her tightly but gently, trying to reassure her, even though he didn't know if his words were reaching her. The silence between them was thick and heavy. There were so many things Miller wanted to ask her, but he knew it wasn't the right time. She had been through enough already. The officers around him were talking to the man now, taking his statement, doing their jobs. But Miller's focus was on Evie. He couldn't let himself be distracted, not when she was still so small, so fragile in his arms. Is she okay? One of the officers asked, noticing Miller's silence. He was just trying to make sure the girl wasn't physically hurt, but Miller could see the concern in his eyes. He knew, just like Miller did, that what Evie had been through wasn't just physical. It was psychological, emotional. It wasn't something that would heal overnight. Miller nodded, but it wasn't a comforting gesture. He wasn't sure if she was okay, not yet. She's been through a lot, he said softly. We'll get her checked out. But she's alive. That's what matters. The officer gave a quick nod, understanding the unspoken truth between them. They both knew Evie's journey was far from over. The real work, helping her heal, helping her find her voice again, had only just begun. Miller shifted slightly, cradling Evie as gently as he could, still cautious of the way she flinched when anyone got too close. She wasn't ready for that, yet, not after everything she had been through. But Miller knew that she would be eventually. They would make sure of it. The man, now under arrest, was being escorted out of the terminal. His face was a mix of anger and defeat. But Miller didn't feel any sympathy. He didn't know what had happened to this man, or why he had been involved with Evie, but it didn't matter now. Justice was on its way. Miller looked down at Evie again, feeling a surge of protectiveness. He wasn't going to let anything happen to her, not while he still had breath in his body. "You're safe now," he whispered, even though he wasn't sure if she could hear him. The silence hung in the air between them, heavy and unyielding. But it was a silence Miller welcomed. It was the silence of a child finding safety again, of a life returning to normal. It was the kind of silence that let Miller know he had done his job. He had brought her home. But as he stood there holding her, the weight of the world seemed to crash down on him all over again. The man's cryptic words echoed in his head. She wasn't supposed to be part of this. Who had made those decisions? Who was pulling the strings? Miller knew this wasn't just a random act. This wasn't the work of a simple criminal. No, this was part of something bigger. And that something had only just begun to reveal itself. Evie lifted her head slightly, peering out from beneath the edge of her sunglasses. Her eyes, big, round, and full of a quiet sadness, met Miller's for the first time since he had found her. She didn't speak, but the look in her eyes was enough to break his heart. She wasn't just a victim, she was a survivor. The officers were now wrapping up their statements, preparing to take the man away. But Miller wasn't ready to let go just yet. Not until Evie was ready. "Miller," one of the officers called, his voice a little louder now. "We need to head out. We'll take her in for a full checkup and get her into protective custody." Miller nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving Evie's face. She still hadn't spoken a word, but he wasn't sure if that was because she didn't want to, or if she just didn't know how to anymore. The trauma she had endured, it wasn't something that would go away just because she was safe now. It would take time. Time. That's what she needed. But Miller would be there every step of the way. He wasn't going to let her down. Not now. Not ever. As the officers moved to escort him and Evie to the waiting vehicle, Miller's thoughts raced. The truth was still out there, and the pieces of the puzzle were scattered, far from fitting together. But Miller knew one thing for sure. He was going to find out who was behind this, and he would make sure that justice was served, no matter what it took. But for now, Evie was safe. And that was all that mattered. Thank you for following along with this story. What do you think is really going on behind the scenes? Do you think Miller will uncover the truth, or will there be more surprises ahead? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss what happens next.